welcome to Moody Reads. My name is Beck, and today I'm going to be doing a video discussion of The Great Gatsby and the retelling that I read, The Chosen and the Beautiful. This will have spoilers in it, especially for Gatsby. I don't think that there's a way to do a video like this where there's spoilers for Gatsby and not for Chosen and the Beautiful, because it's a retelling and a lot of the same events happen. So go into this knowing that. I'm going to start talking just about The Great Gatsby, about my impression of it, especially since I haven't read it in a really long time, like kind of what my impressions are, some of the themes within it, and I'm going to actually specifically talk about the queerness in it and actually go through the passages that I marked, because that was such a fun part of reading it for me. And then after that, I'm going to go into The Chosen and the Beautiful, my thoughts on it as a retelling, and how it responded to a lot of the themes in the original. So, The Great Gatsby is a book that focuses on this really rich man in the 1920s. Jay Gatsby throws parties at his house, but is very elusive. Not a whole lot of people really know who he is. This is all narrated by his neighbor, Nick Carraway. Now, the first time that I read this book was around 2008 or 2009. I was a sophomore in high school. I don't really remember very much about what we talked about when I was in school, to be honest. I know that we didn't talk about the queer themes because it was Tennessee in 2009, so we just didn't. Getting into the actual book itself, I have mixed feelings about whether or not I even like this book. This was such a fun, read, getting to, just analyze the fuck out of it was an amazing time. But I don't know if I liked it. I do think that there are pieces of brilliance in it, but it's been interesting kind of trying to reflect and, figure that out. And I think that the more that I think about it, the more, the more difficult that it gets for both of these. I think my star rating of The Chosen and the Beautiful actually went up over time, really thinking about it more. All of the characters in here are just terrible people. And my first reading of it, I don't remember thinking that about Nick, the narrator. Definitely about everybody else though. But Nick is also a piece of shit. He is this kind of working class person. He's not really rich. And in the beginning of the book, he's I just really don't like rich people. He says that he doesn't like the culture, and then spends all of his free time hanging out with the shittiest person on the planet, Tom, who is openly cheating on his wife and brings up white supremacist rhetoric in the middle of random conversations. It's really gross. And you're supposed to think that he's shitty. Looking at the actual writing of this book, I thought that the pacing was interesting. And not just the pacing, but also the writing style, I suppose. Because there are some scenes with really vivid imagery that's really beautifully written. And then there will be sections, a lot of it actually is really detached. You don't even really get a full picture of Nick's life. He mentions in the book, this isn't my whole life. I go to work. I do other things. There's kind of a girl that I'm seeing, maybe not really. I'm trying not to. And that's just very blasé. Which is really interesting, which I think, obviously this story is supposed to be, about Gatsby, but the fact that Nick minimizes this whole other part of his life, I think says a lot. But I don't want to get into the gay themes quite yet. But really, I think a lot of the elements of this really do just lead up to the larger theme of, disillusionment with the American dream, and they kind of build up to that. And it's really interesting because of how many layers they are, and it's also interesting to see the faults in some of that too, like some of the faults in what the book is doing, or at the very least in what the narrator is doing. So if you studied this in school, you're probably at least a little bit familiar, like, you know, that I think that like a more standard discussion of like disillusionment with the American dream and the Great Gatsby is looking at Gatsby's focus on really wanting to get Daisy back. This plot, like the main thing that he's doing, the reason that he hosts these parties, the reason that he gets close to Nick, is so that he can talk with Daisy, who he was in love with when he was younger and then had to go to war. So they fell out of contact. And he holds Daisy up as this pinnacle of like everything that he wants. And it blows up spectacularly. But I think even before it blows up, I don't think that it really even lived up to his standards to his expectations anyways. So like that's the main piece that's like, you know, analogous to you know, the problem with the American dream, the unattainability, the fault in the idea itself, because the reality is never going to live up to your expectations. And if you do a whole lot of shit, especially if you do it in a really questionable way, it's going to blow up. However, there are a lot more layers that kind of like point to this as well. A lot of the other characters in general, like this shows how just awful kind of like the lifestyle of the time, the overconsumption, the kind of just not really caring about other people. All of the people in here are shitty, and none of them actually care about each other. And that's really clear in how Tom treats everyone, how Daisy treats everyone, even Gatsby. Gatsby doesn't actually care about anyone but Daisy, and even then he only cares about the idea of Daisy. And I would argue the same for Nick. He fucking hates Tom, even though he's the person that he hangs out with. He doesn't even like Gatsby, but I would argue is like in love with him anyways. So like he claims to hate, you know, the kind of like posh lifestyle, and yet he's indulging it any chance he can get. So I think all of those characters, like in and of themselves, kind of show the fault kind of in the culture, or the issues with the culture. And there's an additional layer in here that is a little bit difficult to talk about, because I think that whether or not it was intended by the author changes how we should look at it. But I don't know if it's the author's intention, or if we could even know if it was the author's intention. But that is the role of racism within this book. This book is incredibly racist. To start out, Tom, just like, you know, over dinner starts talking about like the Great Replacement theory, like literal white supremacy, and people are like, oh, Tom. And like initially with him bringing that up, I thought that it was just, okay, so Tom's just a massive piece of shit, you know, just talking about just white supremacy over dinner. But then you have other characters that kind of like sprinkle it in, like you have like I forget if it's Daisy or Jordan, but they mention like their white girlhood and stuff, and like that's weird. It's getting very weird. But it would make sense to talk about white supremacy in context of capitalism. But it would make sense if these people are really shitty that they would be white supremacists, and that would be commented on. But then you get further into the story and you see how Nick describes people. There is some horrendous anti-Semitism that happens when he meets Gatsby's Jewish friend. It's it's honestly, I was not expecting it. But it's fucking horrific. And then shortly after, he also describes some of the few black people that are in the book in just a casually, like, very atrocious way. It's like maybe a paragraph. And it was very disturbing. So it's hard to know how many pieces of the racism in this book are actually supposed to be like something smart about white supremacy and capitalism versus just F Scott Fitzgerald being a racist. And I don't know. And could I perhaps read more biography on F Scott Fitzgerald? Yes. Am I going to do that? Not currently. So if anyone has input, feel free to, put that down below. But something that makes it, like, additionally, like, hard to parse apart. There's no intentional conversation that happens around race within this, which is an issue. Now, I think that there is some textual evidence to indicate that some of it, like, might be intentional, and, like, there might be something here. Gatsby, J. Gatsby, his name at birth was James Gatz, and I did a little bit of digging. Again, I don't feel like really, like, committing to the bit, and I don't really feel like reading tons and tons of articles, but I did see that there were some people kind of discussing a certain Jewish figure who did change his name in order to distance himself from that, and kind of gain popularity, gain status. So there is a chance, I think, that was very intentional. So the discussion of anti-Semitism and the bits of white supremacy that Tom brings up, I think that there's an argument to be had that was supposed to be in conversation with that. I've also heard from friends that I've talked to since I've read this that their classes actually discussed the possibility of Gatsby being mixed race, and there being some textual evidence for that, which I think would say a lot in kind of a similar way as well. With that being said, I think that would account for the stuff that Tom said. Potentially the gross anti-Semitism that Nick engages in, because that would just be another thing of, like, showing that Nick is not actually immune to this culture. Even though he claims to hate it, he's, getting drunk with a bunch of rich fucks and being wildly racist. I don't think that it would account for the anti-black racism, though, especially because while some of the other stuff is, like, very clear and over the top and, like, comes up multiple times, well, it's very clear that, like, that piece of it is very intentional. The very brief description of the black people who were driving in a car, I don't think that would account for it. So that's also something to think about going into this. But also, I think regardless of whether or not all of that was intentional, I think that the fact that there is racism baked into this kind of just reveals another layer of not just, like, issue with the American dream, but issue with the critique itself. So going back to looking to Nick as a character, he is apparently doesn't like rich people and is middle class, but is still engaging in the same culture. He calls himself an honest man. He says that he's the only honest man that he knows, and yet is being two-faced with all of these people, and I would argue is deeply repressed and gay, which is another, not that, like, repression is intentional lying, but it's still, like, lying to yourself, right? Like, all of that kind of shows on a certain level the I guess potential issues with some people who kind of try to surface level critique materialism or the American dream or what have you. But seeing the kind of racism that's baked into this gives us another layer of why seeing a bunch of white people engaging in critique of capitalism fails massively, because they're not considering the issue of racism at all. And nothing in this book certainly gets at the actual, deep-seated institutions of racism. So the book in and of itself, gives us another layer. It's kind of like meta of how we can critique these things and why very white interpretations and critique fall flat, which I think is very interesting. And that's, again, another thing that, like, why I can't decide whether or not I like the book, because that is a huge place that it falls short. But it's kind of like, because it falls short, it, like, gives it a whole other layer of, like, stuff to unpack. Like, it's, I don't know how to properly describe what I'm trying to say, but those are kind of my thoughts on the book on that level, on kind of that main theme. So now I'm gonna get into Nick Carraway being exceptionally gay. And this was honestly the main thing that I was looking for when I was reading it, because we weren't going to talk about it being gay when I was reading it in school. I think there was only like one section that I really thought, that's kind of weird. And then the rest of it I think went over my head. But this time I have tabs. The lighter tabs, the yellow tabs, are racism, which I just got done talking about, but all the orange tabs are gay, explicitly gay, or when he's describing men versus women, because it's a very gay situation. There is some stuff that we have that's more overt, like at the end of chapter 2 when he's drunk and you're kind of getting this cycle of like bits and pieces that he remembers. And I'll just read the quote. One of those bits and pieces is, he says, "I was standing beside his bed and he was sitting up between the sheets, clad in his underwear, with a great portfolio in his hands." He's with a pantsless man in said pantsless man's bed. A man that seemed quite queer-coded. Like, this was the photographer guy, and like everything about the way that him and his wife are described is like a beard situation. And I think that was the implication too. So that's explicitly gay. He literally goes home with a man. So that in and of itself is a lot. But there's also, like I said, the way that he describes men. Even Tom, who he doesn't like at all. I'm just going to be reading you a lot of gay quotes, and I would apologize, but I'm not sorry. On page 7, he says, he's describing Tom. "Not even the effeminate swank of his riding clothes could hide the enormous power of that body. He seemed to fill those glistening boots until he strained the top lacing, and you could see a great pack of muscle shifting when his shoulders moved under his thin coat. It was a body capable of enormous leverage, a cruel body." A lot of focus on the muscle. It just, especially compared with his description of the women, which is like pretty minimal. Then we'll move on to how he describes Gatsby's smile. And there are 2 different quotes for this because he talks about it more than once. So, on page 48, "He smiled understandingly. much more than understandingly. It was one of those rare smiles with a quality of eternal reassurance in it that you might come across 4 or 5 times in life. It faced, or seemed to face, the whole external world for an instant, and then concentrated on you, with an irresistible prejudice in your favor. It understood you just as far as you wanted to be understood, believed in you as you would like to believe in yourself, and assured you that it had precisely the impression of you that at your best you hoped to convey. And that's not even the whole paragraph where he's describing Gatsby. But like... And then there's a little bit later on too that talks about a smile, but then goes on a little more. It says, he smiled, and suddenly there seemed to be a pleasant significance in having been among the last to go, as if he desired it all the time. So he's like writing a whole novel about this man's smile, glad to be desired. I'm sorry, but that's just not very heterosexual. And then you can also look at the way that he describes women, or the potential of being with a woman. Early on in the story, you know that he was almost engaged to marry, and that's kind of one of the reasons why he moved. He says, you can't stop going with an old friend on account of rumors, and on the other hand, I had no intention of being rumored into marriage. Which, on one hand, it's valid that you don't want to be pushed into a marriage, but on the other hand, with like the culture of everything, plus everything else, like that by itself I don't think would be necessarily an indication. But when we've got all this other stuff, we can move on to kind of how he describes Jordan Baker, because he is with her, seeing her to a certain extent. On page 57, he writes, at first I was flattered to go places with Jordan because she was a golf champion and everybody knew her name. Then it was something more. I wasn't actually in love, but I felt a sort of tender curiosity. And then another description later on, page 80. Unlike Gatsby and Tom Buchanan, I had no girl whose disembodied face floated along the dark choruses and blinding signs. So I drew up the girl beside me, tightening my arms. Her one scornful mouth smiled, and I drew her up again closer, this time to my face. I think that was describing a kiss, too, which is like the most disconnected. And then later, this is page 135, so this is on his birthday, which he mentions in passing and is kind of depressing about it, honestly. It says, but there was Jordan beside me, who, unlike Daisy, was too wise to carry well-forgotten dreams from age to age. As we passed over the dark bridge, her wan face fell lazily against my coat's shoulder, and then the formidable stroke of 30 died away with the reassuring pressure of her hand. So we drove toward death through the cooling twilight. That's so fucking depressing. So, everything that he says about women and, like, Jordan just seems like a gay man. Just like a gay man. Because, especially I think the description where he says, you know, I was not in love with her, but I was, like, curious. Like, a piece of that, I think, has to do with the allure of, like, rich people. But a piece of it could have also been, like, some sort of genuine connection. As someone who is gay, but has dated people that I'm not attracted to before, like, I at least read it, so maybe I'm projecting, but I at least read it as kind of that kind of complicated, more kind of complicated feeling. But with him, I feel like there is a status piece in there as well. And then finally, we're going to go back to his discussion of Gatsby, because he actually talks about how he feels about Gatsby, kind of towards the end of the book. And these are actually the last words that he says to Gatsby. We shook hands and I started away. Just before I reached the hedge, I remembered something and turned around. They're a rotten crowd, I shouted across the lawn. You're worth the whole damn bunch put together. I've always been glad I said that. It was the only compliment I ever gave him, because I disapproved of him from the beginning to end. First, he nodded politely, and then his face broke into that radiant, understanding smile, as if we'd been in ecstatic cahoots on that fact the whole time. His gorgeous pink rag of a suit made a bright spot of color against the white steps, and I thought of the night when I first came to his ancestral home 3 months before. The lawn and drive had been crowded with the faces of those who guessed at his corruption, and he stood on those steps, concealing his incorruptible dream as he waved them goodbye. I feel like I don't even need to describe why, you know? And then the last kind of bit that I had was just how he was after Gatsby died, and how he kind of took up the mantle of like figuring everything out, and the fact that he like felt like that's what Gatsby would want him to do, which of course doesn't inherently have to be romantic, but again, in the context of the rest of this, just didn't seem very heterosexual. So those are my thoughts on kind of the gay elements to all of that. From there, we can actually start talking about The Chosen and the Beautiful. And as a retelling, I thought this was spot on. They actually used some of the dialogue from Gatsby and put it in this. Also, they get the pacing and style dead on. Like, the mix of, very detached and kind of the vivid descriptions for things that are more meaningful sprinkled throughout. So I thought that was really great. And really, like, because they did that so well is, like, also why I have such a hard time knowing whether or not I like it, because as a retelling, I think that a lot of the choices that they made were perfect. However, as a reader, I would have liked more information. So it's like, do I think that they should have done it differently? Probably not, but it still made my enjoyment of it complicated, if that makes sense. Like, there's a lot that's going on in regards to like the magic and the world that's in it. So The Chosen and the Beautiful is set in 1920s, but in kind of a fantastical version of the 1920s. There are demons and other kinds of magic, but there's still a lot of similar things going on, like politically. There's still the issue of racism that they kind of go into. And the main character, Jordan, is a Vietnamese adoptee. So she was adopted from Vietnam when she was very young and brought to the United States. I think that this book got really spot on, like, the characters. Like, again, none of them are really likable, and that sort of thing. But going back to the kind of magic system, and they didn't really explain a whole lot, which in general, like, world building kind of goes over my head a fair amount of the time if it's super intense, but even I felt like something was missing. But the thing is, it kind of makes sense that they wouldn't go into it with the kind of level of detachment that was present in the original. And I also think that even though we don't get the world building, I think that what we do get is very metaphorically resonant. It's very much fits in with the like problems of materialism and the culture surrounding all of that. There's a lot of discussion of people who are soulless and some other things that I won't get into because I don't want to like completely spoil everything. But I think as a retelling, that's fucking brilliant. But if you go in not really knowing that much about Gatsby or like why they would be writing it like that, it might be confusing. But it was an interesting decision and I thought that it fit. This book also contends with some of the racism that was in the original, with the character being Vietnamese. she does kind of challenge Tom on some of his bullshit to a certain extent. And it actually talks about some of the laws and so forth that were passing that would have impacted even somebody who legally immigrated and had been there forever. And that's something that she really contends with towards the end. And there is a fair amount of discussion of that sort of identity, because she's very much entrenched in this white, rich culture. But as much as she is an insider, she's also still an outsider. And there's some exploration of that, as well as what it's like for her to kind of go into spaces where there are people like her, and how there's still that distance even within those spaces. And then the final, I think, really big thing that we could look into is, again, the queer themes. In this, Jordan is incredibly bisexual. She is not really interested in finding like a suitor. She's just kind of interested in hooking up with people at parties. She hooks up with men, with women. There's also a discussion of some other characters as well. It seems to me that Daisy is probably on the ace spectrum. She says, Jordan says that, she definitely isn't interested in girls, but she also got the impression that she didn't really want very much to do with guys when it came to anything sexual. So I thought that was interesting. And then you also got definitely a sense of queerness from both Gatsby and Jay. Gatsby is still very much in love with Daisy, but he still, sees other people and stuff like that. And there's definitely something that goes on between Gatsby and Nick. Although this is from Jordan's perspective, so you don't get to see that stuff directly, but you kind of know that it's happening. And it's, I think, much more clear that Nick is in love with Jay. And really, I would argue that even though throughout a decent portion of this, Nick is like with Jordan, I would still argue that Nick is gay. Now, don't get me wrong. Like, there's clearly bisexuality happening. Like, Jordan is massive bisexual. Nick, however, is a gay man who's having an affair with a woman. And I say that partly because he's literally only with other men. Like, initially he doesn't talk about who he's with in that degree. But eventually it does come into conversation. And again, like, the way that he interacts with Jordan, and the way that, like, his feelings for her are, how he talks about it, it seems really clear that he doesn't feel that way about her. Again, maybe I'm just projecting because of my own personal experience with this. But I wish that I had a copy of the book so that I could actually mark it up, but I didn't. I wasn't able to get my own copy. There are certain lines in certain places when they're talking about that I felt really unexpectedly seen in that experience, because he clearly, I think, has a good time with Jordan on a certain level. But it's clearly, there's a larger scene towards the end that I'm not going to go into describing, but where it's made very clear, I think, that he, at the very least, doesn't like her romantically, or can't like her on that kind of deep level. So I thought that was a really interesting, like, exploration of sexuality and relationships throughout all of them, honestly. Not just, you have Nick's relationship with Gatsby and Jordan. You have Gatsby's relationship with Daisy, and Gatsby and everyone else. And even Jordan's relationship with different people, and Daisy's relationship. Because there's definitely something strong between Jordan and Daisy. But because Daisy doesn't like her on that level, you know, it's never going to be like purely like kind of a typical romance, but there is definitely still that pull. So there's a lot of complicated, messy stuff going on, and I thought it was really cool to see a more nuanced, less black and white, very messy kind of look at relationships like that. I feel like there is more that I could go into with both of these, but those are, I think, my main thoughts, and the stuff that I don't discuss, I think will be interesting for others to read. I didn't want this to be going into a lot of detail with a ton of spoilers, just because there's a lot of really cool stuff that I think you should experience for yourself if you choose to read The Chosen and the Beautiful. So those are my thoughts on The Great Gatsby and The Chosen and the Beautiful. If you've read them, definitely let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And thank you all so much for watching. Bye.